Welcome to FolkFear, where ancient rituals whisper through the trees, where forgotten villages breathe in silence, and where every legend is a warning, not a tale. Tonight, we invite you to step into the swamp. Not just any swamp, but one where the dead are silenced, not with prayers, but with clay. This is the story of the last mouth. In a village swallowed by wet earth and time, the dying are sealed with masks made of mud, so their souls won't wander. But one woman died with her mouth open, and now her descendants are choking in the dark, as if she's trying to breathe through their lungs. A granddaughter dares to dig up the past, but what she finds is not a body. It's a hunger that was never buried. So light a candle, lock the doors, and listen closely, because in this story, the dead aren't trying to speak, they're trying to breathe.
There is a village buried deep in a swamp. So deep, in fact, that even maps have stopped looking for it. The ground there is never dry, the wind never warm, and strangers who wander too far in rarely wander back out. Locals don't give the village a name, because names hold power, and this place already has too much of it. Dusk settles like a bruise across the sky, turning the air thick and purple. The trees creak with age, and the soil exhales the smell of rot, wet leaves, old water, something sour beneath it all. Everything breathes here, even the things that should not. Inside a weathered wooden house on the edge of the village, a family gathers in silence. No one speaks, no one cries. Crying during a ritual is dangerous. It gives the earth permission to taste your sorrow. And once it tastes you, it remembers. On a woven reed bed lies an old man named Niran, barely alive. His chest rises with effort, like every breath is a negotiation. A thin strip of paper has been placed over his lips, not for superstition, but for certainty. If the paper stops moving, the soul is on its way out. A woman kneels beside him. She is known only as the Facemaker. Her hands are stained with years of clay and ash. Around her neck is a pouch made of dried oxhide, inside which is the sacred clay of the dead, drawn from the village's ancestral well, mixed with pig's blood and burnt herbs. The mixture is grayish-black, thick and cold as old breath. Without a word, the woman begins her task. She dips her fingers into the pouch and scoops out a handful of the damp clay. First, she presses it gently onto the man's forehead, then over his eyelids, cheeks, jaw. Finally, she hovers near the mouth, waiting. This is the essence of the ritual known as the last mouth. A funerary mask must be molded over the face of the dying in the exact moment their soul escapes, so it may capture the shape of that soul, sealing it safely within. If the mask is applied too early, the spirit may be trapped in agony. Too late, and the soul escapes, untethered, doomed to drift and consume what remains of its bloodline. The paper on the man's lips trembles once, then it stills. The Facemaker moves with eerie precision, pressing the final layer of clay over his mouth, sealing it shut. For 13 heartbeats, no one in the room breathes. Then she slowly peels the mask off. The clay, still soft, now bears the impression of his face, his closed eyes, his slightly parted lips. His final breath, caught in a permanent hush. The family exhales in unison. A boy, perhaps a grandson, steps forward and lifts the mask with shaking hands. He carries it to the family altar. There, on the back wall, hangs a grid of similar masks, dozens of them, some cracked with age, others fresh and raw. Each mask is a face. Each face is a story, a memory, a soul that once breathed in this house. As the boy places the new mask in an empty spot on the altar, one of the candles sputters and dies. No one relights it. That too is part of the ritual. It means the soul has settled. It means no one will choke tonight. A few hours later, Aria arrives home. She is the youngest granddaughter, newly returned from the city, still smelling faintly of gasoline and rain. Her shoes are caked in mud, not the swamp's mud, but some other foreign earth. Her presence feels out of place here, like a breeze in a sealed room. She bows respectfully, her eyes scanning the altar. She sees the new mask placed there, her grandfather's, solemn and still. She steps closer, trailing her gaze over the other masks: Great Uncle Tom, Aunt Rika, Cousin No, Mother Pina, all labeled with carved names and dates, a lineage in clay. But something is wrong. Between the masks of her great-grandfather and her grandfather is a gap, an empty space, a silence in the wall of faces. "Where is Matriarch Ida?" Aria asked. The room goes still. Her question falls like a stone into a deep, dark pond. No one answers. No one even looks at her. She turns to her aunt, but she merely lowers her eyes and begins clearing the ritual tools. Her cousin pretends not to hear. The facemaker is already gone. Aria frowns. She remembers faintly a story told in hushed whispers when she was little, that Matriarch Ida, her great-grandmother, had died many years ago, angry, betrayed, abandoned. They said no one dared touch her body, no one performed the last mouth ritual, no mask was ever made. She died with her mouth open, someone had whispered once, and no one closed it. A chill settles on Aria's spine. The air in the room grows thicker, as if it's trying to press her into silence too. Outside, frogs croak in strange rhythms, not the usual call of mating or rain, but a wet, strangled sound, like someone trying to breathe through water, like a throat filling with earth. Aria turns back to the altar. In the midst of all the masks, all the faces frozen in time, there is a gap, a black hole where no mask hangs, and it looks disturbingly like a mouth that is still waiting to be sealed.
The house was not silent. Even though no one spoke, even though the wind refused to move through its warped wooden slats, the house breathed. It creaked and sighed, shifted and whispered, not in sound, but in feeling. A cold draft that licked the skin without air, a pressure behind the eyes when no one was watching, a subtle weight on the chest when you lay down to sleep, as if something had already claimed that space. Aria wandered the ancestral home alone that night. The funeral rituals were done. The candles burned low. Everyone else had retired to their mats or the neighboring house, where the living preferred to gather when death lingered too long in the air. But Aria couldn't leave. Something about the missing mask gnawed at her. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something closer to unease,
like a splinter of breath stuck in her throat. She returned to the altar and stared at the gap between the masks. The wall felt incomplete. The faces around it seemed subtly tilted inward, as though recoiling from that absence or watching it. The space wasn't just empty, it was hungry. She moved her fingers across the wooden shelf beneath the masks. Each name was carved deep and sharp. Grandfather Nyan, year 1935. Uncle Jet, fever in the floods. Baby Mira, 7 days old. But where matriarch Ida should be, nothing. No mark, no carving. Just smooth wood, as if no one had ever stood there, as if she had been erased. Aria turned sharply toward the hallway. She needed answers. Someone in this family had to remember. Someone had to know why the matriarch of the bloodline, the woman who birthed this entire clan, was denied the sacred rite. She found her aunt Juan in the back room, folding ceremonial cloths with tight mechanical motions. The moment she saw Aria enter, she stiffened. "Auntie," she said quietly, "why isn't Grandmother Ida on the altar?" Juan didn't look up. "Some things are better left buried." "That's not an answer," Aria said. Juan's jaw clenched. "Ida cursed this house with her final breath. She spat her last words at her children. She refused the mask. No one dared touch her, not even the facemaker." "She refused?" Aria asked. Juan looked up at her, eyes bloodshot and hard. "You weren't here. You didn't see what happened to her face. That mouth," she cracked, then lowered to a near whisper. "That mouth wasn't human anymore." Aria froze. "She died with her eyes open," Juan continued. "Open wide, and her mouth wider. It was like something was trying to climb out of her. Something old, something that didn't belong to this family anymore." "She was your mother," Aria said, her voice quiet but firm. "She was, and then she wasn't." The room fell into a thick silence. Juan turned away and began folding again. The folds were too sharp, too angry. Aria stood there a while longer, waiting, but her aunt would say no more. That night, Aria lay awake in her childhood room. She hadn't been here in over a decade, and the memories clung to the walls like mold, musty and half-forgotten. The bed was too short. The window had no glass. Outside, the swamp pulsed like a heartbeat. Frogs groaned. Something distant plopped in the water, heavy and deliberate. She couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to that empty spot on the altar. What happens to a soul without a mouth? The village believed that when the final breath leaves the body, it carries the shape of the soul in it. If you do not catch it, it will wander, and if it has nowhere to go, it will return to where it came from. Home. Aria's breath caught. She sat up in bed. Suddenly, she was aware of how still the house had become. The frogs had stopped croaking. The insects had gone silent. The swamp held its breath. Then, softly, almost imperceptibly, came a sound. Breathing, but not hers. It came from beneath the floorboards, a ragged, wet breath, as though lungs filled with mud were dragging air in, gasping, struggling to remember how. She held still, not even daring to blink. The breath grew louder, closer. It moved toward the door. Then it stopped. Silence. Aria scrambled from the bed and grabbed the string of dried red pepper pods hanging above the door. Every room in the ancestral house had one. It was a ward, a weak one, but something. Her hand trembled as she held it like a charm. Minutes passed. Nothing came. She didn't sleep that night. At dawn, she returned to the altar. Something had changed. One of the masks, her great uncle's, had fallen off the wall. It lay on the ground, split down the center. Aria picked it up slowly. The inside of the mask was wet. The clay was supposed to dry and harden within hours of the ritual, but this one was damp, soft, as if someone had breathed into it all night. She touched the broken edge. A faint smell rose from it, rot and swamp water. She looked up at the remaining masks. None of them felt reassuring anymore. They no longer seemed like guardians. They looked like hostages. And the empty space, it felt wider now, like a missing tooth that throbbed inside the family's skull. Something was coming back to claim that space, not for memory, not for honor, but for air. Aria took the broken mask outside and buried it under the mango tree where her mother used to sit and chew betel leaf. She whispered a prayer under her breath, not to the gods, but to the soil. As she stood, she felt a pressure in her chest, as if her breath wasn't entirely her own, as if something else had taken a sip.
Aria stood before the family altar again. The morning light filtered through the warped wooden slats of the ancestral house, catching particles of dust that swirled like lost souls in the still air. It was too quiet. Even the insects outside seemed to crawl slower near the walls of this room, as if something unseen pulsed beneath the floor, beneath the altar, beneath the earth. She traced her fingers along the space where Matriarch Ida's mask should have been. Nothing had been carved, no indent, no rope nail, just smooth, aged wood. No place for her. Or maybe no one dared make a place. It didn't make sense. In this village, the dead were more sacred than the living. You could abandon a baby, but never a corpse. You could let your house rot, but not a mask. Because here, the body only dies once. But the soul dies slowly unless you give it somewhere to rest. And Ida, the matriarch of the bloodline, had been denied rest. Aria pulled a stool from the corner and climbed up, examining the entire altar with more care. She tapped the wood. Some panels were hollow, some solid. She tried pulling gently at the middle beam. A faint creak, and then it moved. Behind one of the vertical panels was a compartment, not large, not locked, just hidden. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in layers of crumbling cloth, was a mask, but it wasn't like the others. It had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless oval of clay, hardened completely, no strings for hanging, no name. Aria touched it. It was cold, colder than anything in the house, even colder than the air around the altar. A chill rushed up her fingers and settled in her shoulder, as if the mask had drawn something out of her hand and was holding it there, waiting. She almost dropped it. Was this supposed to be Ida's mask? A punishment? A mockery? Or perhaps a ward? She stared at it. No features, no trace of breath, no memory of humanity. Just silence. Absolute, unnatural silence. She wrapped it back in the cloth and placed it gently in her lap. Later that afternoon, she found the oldest living relative, Great Aunt Taya, half-blind and nearly deaf, wrapped in layers of wool and forgotten rituals. She sat at the edge of the village near the roots of a banyan tree, plucking dead leaves and whispering to the soil. "Taya," Aria said, kneeling beside her, "I found a mask behind the altar, a blank one, no eyes, no nose, no mouth." The old woman didn't respond at first. "Taya," Aria tried again. "Is it hers? Is it Matriarch Ida's mask?" Taya stopped plucking. Her head tilted slightly.
Then she whispered, "That's not a mask." Aria froze. "What do you mean?" Teya's voice was hoarse. "They tried. They made the clay. They waited for her last breath. But when they placed the clay on her face, it wouldn't take. It wouldn't shape. It just sat there, smooth, like the earth was refusing to remember her." "She didn't leave a mark?" "She didn't leave," Teya said. Her hands were trembling now. "That's the problem. She's still waiting." "Waiting for what?" But Teya wouldn't say more. She simply shook her head and turned back to her leaves, whispering a prayer Aria didn't recognize. That night, the air was thick with the scent of rain, though no clouds had formed. Aria couldn't sleep, her thoughts twisted like vines around that blank mask. If the clay refused her face, where did her soul go? Around midnight, the candle in her room flickered. Not from wind, there was none, but as if something had moved beside it, too close, too fast. And then she heard it again, breathing, not her own. It came from the walls. She held her breath. The sound wasn't steady. It shivered, like someone was learning how to inhale again after decades of silence. There was a wetness to it, a sound like breath being dragged through clay. And then, very faintly, a voice. "She has no mouth, so she borrows yours." Aria's chest tightened, her vision blurred, her lips felt cold. She scrambled from the bed, nearly falling. She reached for the dried chili string above the door, but it crumbled in her hand, rotted through. She ran, past the hallway, past the altar, into the open night. And when she turned back toward the house, she swore. In the window of the ancestral room, the masks were hanging crooked, as if trying to turn away from something. And the empty spot in the middle was darker than the night around it, like an open wound or a mouth waiting to be filled.
That night, the house did not rest. Though the rain never came, the air clung to everything like wet cloth, heavy, warm, and wrong. It pressed into Aria's lungs as she returned, barefoot and shaken from the edge of the forest. Her skin prickled with the memory of that whisper. "She has no mouth, so she borrows yours." The words had not come from outside her head. No, they had passed through her breath, curling in her throat like smoke that didn't want to leave. Now, as she stepped over the threshold of the ancestral home, something shifted. The floorboards exhaled. Aria paused. There it was again, that slow, deliberate sound. Not a creak of old wood, not the squeal of vermin, but breathing. Wet, strained, growing louder. It came from beneath the floor. She dropped to one knee, pressing her ear against the aged planks. For a moment, there was only the thrum of her own heartbeat, loud and fast. Then an inhale, drawn from the depths, slurping, gurgling, almost hungry. And then an exhale, right into her ear. She jerked back with a gasp. The floor was cool against her palms, but not dead. It was warm. Something beneath was alive. Aria did not sleep. Instead, she lit all the oil lamps she could find in the house, 6 of them, scattered like tiny suns across the hallway and near the altar. Their light flickered weakly against the dozens of ancestral masks hanging on the wall. Each one looked more warped than before,
as if the clay had subtly shifted in the heat, stretching their lips and hollowing their eyes. She approached the altar again, drawn to that blank space. It was no longer just a space. It was a shadow. Even the light of the nearest lamp wouldn't touch it, as if it were not merely a gap between masks, but a wound in the wall, something waiting to open wider. And Arya knew, deeply, terribly, that the breathing was centered there. It wasn't coming from the swamp. It wasn't coming from under the floor. It was coming from her, from Ida, from the mouth that was never sealed. By dawn, a second mask had fallen. This one was her grandmother's, Ida's daughter. It lay cracked and damp on the floor beneath the altar, the inside of it caved in, as though something had tried to breathe through it. Arya stood frozen above it, her pulse echoing in her ears. And then she saw it, embedded in the broken clay, a fingerprint. Not hers. It was too long, too narrow, and pressed deep, as though someone had pushed their finger from the inside out. Her knees buckled. She fell backward, crawling away from the mask, eyes wide. The dead were not resting. They were being used. Later, she sought out the facemaker. The woman lived alone at the farthest edge of the village, where the water was black and the trees hung low like they were listening. No one dared disturb her often. She was said to speak only when death was near. Arya brought no offering, only questions. The old woman sat cross-legged before a fire, kneading clay, even though no ritual had been called. "I found the blank mask," Arya said. The woman did not look up. "She was never sealed, and now they're choking, one by one." The facemaker's hands paused. "You don't understand. It wasn't that we feared touching her. It was that she wouldn't let us. The moment the clay touched her face, it turned dead, like the earth refused to take her shape." "Then what did you bury?" The woman lifted her eyes. "Something unfinished. Something that needed a mouth." That evening, Arya stood before the family well, the same one where clay for masks was drawn. The rope was gone, the pail broken. The well had been sealed with a lid of rotting wood and a broken mask pressed into the surface like a warning. She pulled the mask free. Underneath, wet clay oozed upward, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. She shouldn't have touched it. She knew that the moment her fingers dipped into the cold mass. It felt like muscle, like lungs, like something exhaling through the earth itself. She backed away, hands shaking. Then she heard it again, the breath, right behind her. She turned. No one. But in the distance, near the house, she saw a figure. Thin, bent, hair long and dripping as if from the grave. The figure stood still, watching. And though she couldn't see the face, she knew. It had no mouth, only a wound in the head where the mouth should be. A soft, pulsing hole, like wet clay, forever trying to shape itself into something it once was. And in that moment, Arya understood. Ida's breath never left her. It only needed someone else to breathe it in.
The morning after the vision by the well, Arya woke with dried clay under her fingernails. She hadn't remembered falling asleep, hadn't remembered returning home, but the clay was real, flaking from her palms, caked into the skin beneath her nail beds. She scrubbed her hands until they bled, but no matter how much she scraped, a thin gray smear still lingered in the creases of her palm. It smelled like wet breath. The village healer arrived before noon. He had not been summoned. No one dared ask for help from outside the family. But he came anyway, walking barefoot through the mud, with dried herbs tied to his wrists and a string of tiny bones hanging from his neck. He entered the ancestral house and stood at the altar without speaking. After a long pause, he removed his necklace of bones and held it out to Arya. "Bury this," he said, "tonight, in the grave of the one without a mask." Arya blinked. "You know?" "We all do," he said, "but your family chose silence over safety. That silence is cracking now." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of fennel and ash. She wasn't buried with a mask. Neither was she buried alone. Arya felt her heart lurch. "What do you mean?" "She cursed your bloodline," he said flatly, "with her final breath. Not with words, but with need, with unfinished breath. You all breathe her air now. You dream her dreams. And one by one, she is reclaiming what she gave you." Arya's throat went dry. He turned to go, but paused at the door. "Be careful digging her up," he added. "The soil remembers, and so does she." That evening, Arya gathered 3 things: a spade blessed with river salt, the healer's bone necklace, and the mask she had found hidden behind the altar, the faceless one. She waited until the air was still and the swamp had gone quiet again. No frogs, no birds, just the sound of distant water choking itself. She made her way to the edge of the graveyard, to the place her family avoided, where the ground sloped wrong, where the trees leaned too far inward, as if bowing to something buried. Matriarch Iri Ada's grave had no marker, no stone, no name. Only a mound of earth, flat and gray, as though even the grass had refused to grow there. Arya knelt and began to dig. The deeper she went, the colder the earth became. Not natural cold, not wind or rain. This was inner cold, the kind that seeped from the marrow of the dead and whispered upward. After several long minutes, her spade struck something soft. She cleared it away with her hands. Not wood, not coffin, just cloth, wrapped in layers, soaked through with mud, but undisturbed. And beneath the cloth, a face, perfectly preserved, lips slightly parted, eyes closed, as if waiting. But what shook Arya wasn't the face itself, it was the mouth, stretched wider than should be humanly possible, wider than skin should allow, and packed full of rotting clay, the same kind she'd pulled from the well, but here it pulsed. It was moving. Arya stumbled back, bile rising in her throat, but she couldn't leave it, not now, not after everything. With shaking fingers, she took the faceless mask from her satchel. The clay was still whole, untouched by time, but cold, so cold it burned her fingertips. She leaned forward and pressed the blank mask gently onto the matriarch's face. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a breath, drawn in through the clay, deep, rattling, as if the mask had found the mouth it had waited for all this time. Arya dropped the necklace of bones into the grave, then began to bury the body again with fast, frantic hands. But as she piled earth back over the corpse, she heard something else from beneath the soil. Not a voice, not a scream,
but a laugh, muffled, wet, delighted. That evening, back at the house, Arya stood before the altar once last. The masks looked different, softer somehow, the mouths slightly more relaxed, as though they'd all been holding their breath for years and were finally allowed to exhale. Except for one. A new mask now hung in the once empty spot, the blank one. It hadn't been hung by her. She had left it buried. And yet, there it was. But it wasn't blank anymore. It had a mouth now. Not a carved one, not molded. A real one. Lips dark and cracked, parted slightly, still moving as though whispering to no one. And beneath it, etched into the wood for the first time, Iriada. She never stopped breathing.
The next morning, the floor of the ancestral house was no longer dry. Arya woke to the sound of dripping, slow, rhythmic, like a leaking faucet. But there were no pipes here, no plumbing, no rain. She sat up and swung her feet to the ground, and her heels sank. The wood beneath the woven mat was wet. She peeled it back. The floorboards, once sun-bleached and brittle, now glistened with a thin coat of swamp water. Not just damp, soaked. And across that waterlogged surface were footprints. Not boot prints, not human strides, bare feet, small, deep, pointing toward the altar. Arya followed them. Each print left a small indentation in the wood, as though the person or thing had stood there for longer than a single step. At the center of each footprint was a small depression, where mud had sunken into the grain and refused to dry. The trail led down the hall, past her mother's old room, toward the altar, and then into the wall. Literally. The final footprint disappeared against the planks directly beneath Matriarch Idawa's mask, the one that hadn't been there the day before. Arya stood frozen, the air pressed into her chest, thick and sour. She didn't need to touch the mask to know. It had breathed again last night, and whatever had worn it was now inside the walls. Later that day, the first of her cousins began coughing. It started as a tickle in the throat, then wheezing, then full-body shudders. He gasped as if something was pressing on his lungs. Doctors were called in from the neighboring district, but the tests showed nothing. Stress, they said, humidity, swamp allergies. But Arya knew better. He wasn't sick. He was suffocating on someone else's breath. She remembered the healer's words. She didn't leave. That's the problem. And now she was sharing her lungs with the bloodline. That night, Arya placed salt along every threshold of the house. She lit incense and pressed red thumbprints over the windows. She boiled bitter herbs, scattered thorns beneath her bed, and whispered her grandmother's name backwards, a trick the midwife once said confuses the dead. But at exactly midnight, the masks began to shift again. Not violently, not with drama, just tilting, one by one, as if looking down, as if ashamed. And then the whisper came, soft, wet, close. You took my mouth, but not my breath. Arya spun, eyes wide. No one, only shadow. But when she looked at the floor again, the footprints had returned, fresh, still glistening. And this time, they were hers. The same shape,
Same size, same spacing, as if she had walked in her sleep, or as if something had borrowed her body to move around. Her knees buckled. She backed away from her own path, heart thundering, breath catching, until her chest locked. No air, no sound, only pressure. She fell to the ground, clawing at her throat, gasping, but nothing came. And then a cold breath slid down her throat from the inside, like someone breathing out while already inside her lungs. Her eyes watered, she choked. Then, just as suddenly, it passed. Air rushed back in. She lay on the floor, shaking. From above, the masks watched in silence. And Idawa's mask? It was smiling. Just a little. Just enough. At dawn, she fled the house, ran barefoot into the swamp, not caring where her feet landed. The world around her shimmered, not with light, but with breath. Everything felt damp. The trees exhaled mist. The ground sighed beneath her steps. She stumbled upon the old clay pit, where villagers once harvested sacred mud for rituals. But it wasn't dry like it should be in dry season. It was bubbling. The surface churned like a stew. Bubbles rose and popped, releasing faint wheezing noises like old lungs struggling to work. And along the bank of the pit, footprints. All sizes, all directions. Some led nowhere, some circled back, and in the middle, one pair of feet, half sunken, standing still. No one was there now, but the impression remained. The footprints hadn't dried and hadn't filled with water, as if they weren't made by a body, but made for one, waiting. That evening, Arya returned home to find her cousin's coughing had worsened. He slept with his mouth open, head tilted back, chest rising in sharp shirks. And over his bed hung Idawa's mask. It wasn't on the altar anymore. No one in the house admitted to moving it, but there it was, dangling by a single red thread. And its lips, wider, slightly parted, just enough to suggest it was breathing for him, or maybe through him. Arya stepped forward. The air around the mask rippled with heat, except it wasn't warm. It was wet, heavy, saturated with something she didn't want to name. She reached for the mask. The moment her fingers touched it, it exhaled right into her face. A breath, long and cold and familiar. Her vision blurred, her ears rang. She staggered back, and in her mind, for just a second, she saw it. Matriarch Idawa standing in the swamp, her mouth sewn shut with clay, but her eyes wide open, and her chest rising. Breathing. Always breathing. Through every child, every grandchild, until the entire bloodline was nothing more than lungs for the dead. The clay never dried. No matter how hot the sun rose over the village, no matter how long the hearth fire burned, the trail of footprints in the house remained soft and damp. They wound in and out of rooms like an invisible thing, pacing, searching, breathing. By the third day, a second cousin fell ill. This time, it wasn't just coughing, it was choking. At dawn, they found him collapsed in the corner of the kitchen, eyes bulging, lips blue, mud caked around his mouth like he'd tried to scream through soil. He survived, barely, but now he wouldn't speak, not even to blink. And when Aria leaned close to his face, she smelled it again. Clay and breath that wasn't his. The villagers had begun to whisper, "She's back. It's the girl. She woke her. She finished what the ancestors sealed." But no one dared say Matriarch Ida's name aloud, not even in prayer. It was as if the mere syllables had been bartered away, traded to the swamp in exchange for silence. And now, silence was breaking. Aria went to the elder tree where the village's memory keeper once sat, a banyan tree older than names, where blood was spilled to mark births and clay buried to mark deaths. The memory keeper had long since passed, but the tree remained, and it whispered. With every breeze, its hanging roots swayed like tongues licking the air. Aria dug at the base of the tree with her bare hands. Her nails tore, her palms bled. She unearthed small bundles of cloth, each wrapped around fragments of broken clay masks, pieces too ruined to display, faces that were denied legacy, or masks that had been rejected by the dead. One of them had a marking scratched onto it, sealed. Another fragment bore 3 red lines, the symbol for returned breath. She stared at them. Her blood soaked into the ground as she knelt. That's when she remembered the well, the original well, not the one near the altar, the new one, blessed and maintained, but the old one. The one sealed with broken masks and red thread, deep in the shadow of the banyan's reach. The one they told the children never to approach, because it never ran dry, even in the driest summers, because it breathed. At dusk, she stood before it. The well was older than memory. The bricks were soft, nearly melting from humidity. The cover, a slab of wood warped with rot, was lashed in place with dozens of torn red threads, each one a failed seal. And at the center of the wood, a face had formed, not carved, grown out of the wood itself. It bore no eyes, no nose, just a massive open mouth, stretched in agony, filled with hardened, cracked clay. Aria reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the wood, the breath came up through the cracks. Not fast, not violent, slow, steady, deep, like the well was exhaling. She stepped back, heart pounding. Then the breath turned into something else, a voice. "You sealed the face, but not the mouth." The rope beside the well, frayed and forgotten, suddenly twitched. Then it snapped upward, jerking taut. Something below had grabbed it. Aria dropped to the ground, her face inches from the stone edge, peering down. Nothing, only darkness, but she could feel it. Not water, not soil, something waiting, not asleep, not dead, just holding its breath. That night, the house exhaled mud. It bubbled up through the cracks in the floorboards, squelching between the woven mats. It ran in streaks down the walls, smeared by invisible fingers. Every family member who had ever avoided Ida's name began to cough, then wheeze, then choke, as if every breath they had borrowed from her bloodline was now being called back. Aria dreamed of the swamp, but in the dream it was inverted. The world turned upside down. The trees grew downward from the sky. The moon dripped into the ground like a leaking wound. And in the middle of the water stood a woman. Not old, not decayed, but full, alive, heaving with breath. Matriarch Ida. Her mouth was sewn shut with red string, but her chest rose with every inhale. And behind her stood the rest of the family. Every ancestor, every dead child, every silent mask, all breathing, all through her. Aria awoke gasping. Her throat was packed with something gritty. She spat into her hands. Clay, still warm, still damp. She screamed. And from the altar, every mask turned downward toward her, except Ida's. Ida's turned its mouth up and smiled.
Aria hadn't spoken in 2 days. Not because her voice had gone, but because every time she opened her mouth, even to sip water or murmur a prayer, she felt it. A second breath, not hers. It rose behind her own, slower, wetter, like something was inhaling through her, quietly waiting for her to speak so it could learn how again. So she stayed silent. But silence wasn't safety anymore. The masks were watching. They no longer hung like relics, dead, distant, respectfully detached. They tilted, leaned, shifted when she wasn't looking. Once she found one on the floor. She picked it up, heart hammering, only to realize its mouth was wider than before. It hadn't broken, it had grown, and the clay was still soft. That evening, Aunt Juan fell. She was carrying a bundle of prayer herbs to burn when her knees buckled and her hands seized. They rushed to her side, but she wasn't choking. She was grinning. Her eyes were glassy, staring up at the ceiling. Her chest rose in shallow, rhythmic gasps, but her lips were open wide, too wide, like her muscles had forgotten how to close them. And from her mouth, in a voice that was not her own, came a whisper. Finally, air. Everyone froze. Aria backed away slowly. Her jaw creaked as it moved, more and more, as if the bone itself was unhinging. Then, a crack. Blood pooled beneath her chin. Her tongue lolled out, blackened with clay. And when they finally tried to lift her, her lungs burst, as if something had swelled too large inside, pressing outward. She died with her mouth open, and before they could close it, flies crawled in and never came back out. That night, the altar changed. A new mask had appeared, still soft, still glistening, still warm. It bore Aunt Juan's face, but it hadn't been made by the facemaker. No one had called her, no one had touched clay. The mask had shaped itself, and beneath it, scrawled into the wood in thin, shaky red, "One, through her I breathed." Aria fell to her knees, trembling. This was no longer about memory, no longer about legacy or mourning. This was a harvest, and every mask on the wall was not a record of the dead, but a mouth that had been used and sealed shut. Except Ida's. Ida's mouth was still open and still smiling. Aria began to dream in reverse. Each night she felt herself breathing backwards, inhaling what others exhaled, exhaling what no one else could see. And always at the edge of her dreams, she saw her reflection, standing in front of a mirror, but her mouth did not move when she screamed. Only Ida's mask did, on the wall behind her, mimicking her terror,
grinning wider, until, finally, one night, the glass cracked, and behind the glass, Ida stepped through. Not old, not broken, but whole, breathing, standing in Aria's place, while Aria stood behind the glass, silent, trapped, a vessel that could only watch. When she awoke, her mouth was full of mud. She ran to the river and vomited until her ribs ached. Black clay, bits of red thread. And in the water's reflection, for a split second, she saw Ida's face in her own. Not just similar, the same. That evening, she tried to tell her uncle. He slammed the door in her face. "Enough," he spat. "No more curses, no more digging. We've done the rituals, we've paid the earth. What more do you want?" Aria answered quietly, hollow-eyed, "I want to close her mouth." His face went pale. He didn't answer, but he didn't stop her. She returned to the grave at midnight, armed with one thing, a shard of mirror and a single mouthful of salt, the last defense in a place where gods had turned away. She dug fast. The soil was looser this time, wetter, and when her fingers reached the wrappings, they were already split. The grave had been opened before, or maybe it had never fully closed. She tore back the cloth. The body was still there, but it was not still. The ribs moved with every breath. The mouth, still stretched wide, pulsed slowly. The clay inside bubbled like swamp lung. Aria leaned forward, gagging, her hands trembling. And then the mouth spoke, but it used her voice. "Aria, let me stay. You're already halfway mine." Her body froze. Her fingers moved without her will, reaching for the face, no, for the mouth, to make room. But then, through the clay, something moved. A tongue, bloated, black. It reached out towards her, seeking her lips. She screamed and threw the salt directly into the mouth. A hiss, then silence. The body convulsed. The breath stopped. The earth shuddered. And for the first time since Ida's death, her mouth closed. Not stitched, not masked, just closed. Aria collapsed in the mud, shaking. But as she faded into unconsciousness, the last thing she saw was the altar, burning in her mind's eye. And Ida's mask? It was gone. But above its empty place, something new was written. If the mouth is closed, the lungs will find another.
Aria returned home with mud still drying in her hair. She had buried the salt-soaked clay deep inside Ida's mouth, watched the corpse seize, twist, then fall still. She had covered it with layers of soil, packed it down with shaking hands, and walked away from the open grave in silence, thinking, "It's over." But when she stepped back into the ancestral house, she knew the truth. It had only just begun. The masks were silent. All of them. Not a single one tilted. None shifted when she entered. Even Ida's mask, the one that had smiled, moved, watched, was gone. In its place, a blank spot. Not the kind of absence that comes from removal. No. This was the kind of absence that comes from something that was never meant to be known. Like a name erased from memory. Like a breath you didn't know you were holding. Aria stood before the altar, heart pounding. Where had the mask gone? She turned to leave the room and froze. There,
Resting on the low ceremonial table near the entryway was a new mask, but not of Ida, of her, Aurea. The features were unmistakable: soft jawline, narrow chin, faint scar above the eyebrow. But the mouth was wrong. Too wide, half open, as if it had never learned to close. She stepped forward. The clay was still damp, still warm, and when she reached out to touch it, it inhaled. She jerked her hand back. Her breath caught in her throat. She staggered to the basin and splashed water on her face. Her reflection rippled, and for a moment, the reflection didn't move with her. It stared back, then smiled. The next day, her cousin, the one who had survived the choking, began speaking again, but not in his own voice. His mother burst into tears the moment she heard him. "That's not his tone. That's not his rhythm. That's—" She didn't finish. Didn't need to. Because when the boy spoke, he used old words, phrases no longer taught, ritual terms only the elders knew. And when he laughed, it wasn't high and childish. It was deep, slow, heavy, an old woman's laugh. Aurea began keeping a journal. Not for sanity, she didn't believe in sanity anymore, but because she needed a record, something real, ink on paper, not carried in breath. Each night, she wrote the same question. If the breath lives on, what happens to the body it leaves behind? And each morning, the answer was different, not written in her hand. Sometimes a single line. You don't leave, you divide. Sometimes just a symbol, a mouth drawn open with roots instead of teeth. One night, she woke with ink smeared across her neck. She checked the journal. Her name was written over and over again. Aurea, 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 each one with a slightly different handwriting, as if multiple versions of her were trying to remember who belonged to the body. The next night she didn't sleep. She sat by the altar, eyes open, candle lit, watching. And just before dawn, she saw it. The wall breathed. Not in a metaphorical way. The wooden planks behind the altar expanded, then contracted. Slow, rhythmic, like lungs. And from the wood came a faint sigh. Not exhausted, not dying. Content. As if the house itself had found a new way to draw breath. Without a mask, without a body, just through the bloodline. Aurea left the house. She walked to the edge of the village, stood in the mist watching the trees. She considered running, but the wind shifted and she heard her name, not whispered, exhaled, from the ground beneath her feet, and she understood. This wasn't a haunting. This was an inheritance. Her family hadn't been cursed by Ida. They had been chosen as lungs, as vessels, and now that Ida's mouth had been sealed, she needed new ones. Not through clay, through flesh, through breath passed down like old recipes and broken stories. And now, it was Aurea's turn. When she returned to the house, the journal was open on her bed. Someone had written a final line, not in ink, in mud. The breath is safe with you now.
The ancestral house had always creaked. Insects lived in its walls. Wind passed through the slats.
Clay dust clung to the ceiling corners like forgotten breath. But now, the house didn't creak. It inhaled. The walls expanded gently in the middle of the night. The beams bowed ever so slightly, as if bracing for something. And then they released, exhaling slow and low through the hallway seams. It was quiet enough that no one in the village would notice, unless they knew how to listen. And Arya had learned. She sat by the altar with her eyes closed, counting the intervals. 7 seconds in, 11 out. Pause, repeat. The exact rhythm of a resting human breath. The house wasn't haunted. It was alive. She first noticed the signs in small ways. Aunt Juan's old sandals, long abandoned near the porch, began collecting mud again. Fresh, wet imprints that hadn't been there the day before. The rice in the jar near the kitchen turned sour overnight, as if something inside had spoiled the air. The family cat stopped entering the house altogether. It sat at the doorway and hissed at nothing, at air. And every night, more of the masks were missing. They weren't broken. They hadn't fallen. They were simply gone. Their absence wasn't empty. It was satisfied, like something had fed. Arya tried to leave. One morning, she packed a bag and stepped off the front steps with the rising sun at her back. She made it as far as the old footbridge at the edge of the village. But when she looked down, she saw it. Footprints in front of her. Her own. Pressed into the mud of the path, leading backward. Back to the house. She turned to run, and felt her breath hitch in her throat. A sharp, invisible tug pulled at her chest like a hook inside her lungs. Her knees buckled. She dropped to the ground, gasping. And in the silence that followed, she heard it again. The house exhaling in relief, as if it had been holding her breath the whole time. She returned. Of course she returned, because the house wasn't just breathing, it was learning. The masks that remained on the altar were no longer passive. Their clay had softened again, subtly shifting from hour to hour, nostrils flaring, lips parting, eyelids lowering. At times, she swore they blinked when she turned away. One afternoon, she caught her reflection in the polished teapot lid. She blinked. The reflection didn't. And behind her, just for a split second, stood a wall of faces not made from clay, but flesh, breathing, watching, waiting. On the third night, the floor pulsed beneath her feet. It didn't creak. It throbbed, like a heartbeat beneath the wood. Lub-dub, lub-dub, the rhythm synced with hers, and then surpassed it, as if her own pulse was being overwritten. She placed her hand on the wall. It was warm and moist, and from within it came a sound, faint but unmistakable. Arya. Not whispered, exhaled, through the wood grain, through the walls, through the mask of the house itself. She moved into the old storeroom, the smallest room, the one least used by the family. She locked the door, burned incense, drew salt lines, but the house didn't fight her. Not yet. It only watched and waited and breathed through her. Each time she dozed off, she felt her chest rising not from her own will, but from some other rhythm. Each time she tried to hold her breath, something deep inside her ribs would push back, like her lungs didn't belong to her anymore, like she was being breathed. One evening, a letter arrived at the door. No career, no name, just a piece of folded wet parchment. Inside, written in trembling charcoal, "Stop resisting. She only breathes through the ones who remember." Arya read it once, then again, and the third time she noticed it was in her own handwriting, but she had never written it. That night, she woke to find her hands pressing soft clay over her own breath, not dry, still alive, still moving, as if shaping itself to fit her final breath. She screamed and flung it away, but it only hit the wall, slid down, and waited on the floor like an obedient dog, waiting to be worn, to be used, to finish what was started. In the morning, the final mask vanished. The altar was bare, but the wall behind it now bore something new, a pattern of thin cracks, vein-like, branching outward. And if she listened closely, pressed her ear against them, she could hear it. Many breaths, layered, stacked on top of each other. Some fast, some slow, some shallow, some not human, and one unmistakably hers. The house no longer needed masks. It no longer needed clay. It had learned. It had adapted. It had inherited. And now it was breathing through wood and memory and blood. And soon it would speak.
The house no longer waited for nightfall to speak. By the 11th day, the voice had found its rhythm. It hummed low through the floorboards, drifting up in waves, soft as a lullaby, but sung in a tongue no one alive remembered. Not words, not melody, just vibration, like the low murmur of a wet throat swallowing between breaths. Arya didn't ask who was speaking anymore. She knew. It was all of them. The first time she heard her own name, it came from under the mat in the corner room. She'd been dozing, mouth dry, limbs heavy, breath sinking unwillingly with the rise and fall of the wooden walls, when she heard it, Arya. Not whispered, not screamed, but breathed. She opened her eyes. The mat beneath her moved. Not much, just enough. Arya sat upright, heart pounding, and then she heard it again, from just below her spine. Arya, you're a good mouth. She tore the mat away and stared at the floor. No cracks, no holes, only the faint trace of muddy fingerprints along the boards, some small, like a child's, others longer than any human hand. She pressed her ear to the floor, holding her breath. Drip, pulse, inhale, exhale, and then a giggle, low, female, familiar. Her own voice, not from her mouth, but from below. That night, she tried to sleep outside. She laid her mat beside the well, wrapped in herbs, her neck lined with ash, the old healer's bone charm clutched tight in her hand.
She watched the stars through the tangle of banyan roots and tried to remember the sound of normal wind. But at some point in the dark, the trees stilled, the stars blinked out, and the earth began to breathe. The well behind her gurgled, not with water, but with something thicker, something warm, something trying to speak. She sat up just in time to see the rope twitch again. It moved slowly at first, just a shiver. Then, as if tugged by invisible lungs, it rose, slithered across the dirt, and coiled itself neatly beside her like a leash waiting for a neck. She stood. She did not scream. She returned to the house, because even in horror, something deep inside her knew there was no outside anymore, not for her. By morning, her voice was no longer entirely hers. When she greeted the passing monk on the road, her lips moved, but the sound came too slowly, as if echoing a fraction of a second behind her. The monk blinked, then bowed low, fear in his eyes, not to her, but to something just behind her. There was no one there, at least not that she could see, but she felt it, a warmth along her spine, a chest rising and falling just inside her own, breathing with her, feeding on every word, waiting for its turn. In the late afternoon, she sat by the altar staring at the blank wall where the masks had once hung. The cracks had grown. Now they spidered out across the boards like veins, some pulsed, some twitched. She leaned in, pressing her fingers to the center, and the wall whispered, "Mouths rot, but breath remains." Then it laughed, a soft, tickling chuckle, as if a grandmother were hiding just beneath the wood, amused by a child's confusion. Arya didn't pull away. She whispered back, "What do you want?" And the floor answered, "You." That night, it began taking pieces of her, not limbs, not skin, memories. She awoke unable to recall her mother's face. The next night, her name. Then, her voice cracked, untrained, like she had never used it before. In the mirror, her lips moved out of sync with her thoughts, and when she tried to speak, another voice came out. Older, wiser, hungrier. We remember what you forget. By the end of the week, she stopped closing the door to the altar room. There was no point. The house was inside her now. Every time she tried to run, her breath shortened. Every time she tried to scream, her mouth filled with warm air, someone else's air. And when she finally, tearfully begged the walls for mercy, the breath answered through the cracks, "You are the seal, and the key, and the passage." And for the first time in her life, she understood. Her family had never been cursed. They had been chosen, not as victims, but as lungs, vessels, vocal cords, carriers of the ancestral breath too old to die. And now it had learned to speak again, through her. One final note appeared in her journal. She didn't remember writing it. It simply was there, in her own crooked scrawl, pressed deep into the page as if carved. "I am not afraid anymore, because I'm not the only one breathing."
Arya woke to the sound of her skin cracking. Not from cold, not from dryness, but from pressure, as if something beneath the surface was shifting, pushing outward, stretching her from the inside. She sat up, panting, Her arms glistened with sweat, but when she wiped them, her fingers came away stained with something thick and gray. Clay. Wet, warm, rising through her pores like it belonged there. She ran to the basin. The mirror above it was fogged over, but not from steam, from breath. The kind that comes from within glass. The kind that doesn't belong to the person staring at it. She wiped it clean with trembling hands. What stared back wasn't unfamiliar, not yet, but it was changing. The shape of her mouth looked subtly wrong, wider, the lips more defined as if carved into place. And beneath her left eye, a faint ridge had formed, like the beginning of a mask seam. She screamed, but even her scream felt muted, like it passed through another layer before it reached the air, like her own breath was being filtered. She gripped the basin and whispered, "This isn't me!" But the clay in her palms pulsed in response, almost comfortingly, as if to say, "It is now." By midday, her joints ached. Every movement felt dampened, like walking through water. The village women who passed her by didn't meet her eyes. One old man, blind in one eye, stopped mid-step, turned his head slowly toward her, and said with hollow breath, "You're holding her well." Then he walked away, as if nothing strange had been said at all. In desperation, Arya visited the last person who might understand, the face-maker. She found her kneeling in the mud near the edge of the dying field, shaping a new mask. It looked too familiar, too recent. Arya's voice trembled. "Is it for me?" The woman didn't look up. "It's not for the dead." "Then what is it for?" The face-maker dipped her fingers into the bowl beside her, gray liquid, thick and glistening. "Some vessels," she murmured, "become so used they begin shaping themselves." Arya's stomach twisted. "I sealed her mouth. I buried the breath. I finished the rite." The woman finally met her eyes. "No," she said softly, "you only gave it a home." That night, Arya felt the clay beneath her fingernails harden. She scratched at her arms and found patches beneath her skin no longer responded. The texture was different, smoother, colder. She dug into one with a knife, not deep, just enough. Instead of blood, clay seeped out, like it had replaced her marrow, like it had grown silently inside her bones. And in the silence of her room, she heard the altar walls breathe again. Slower now, content. It no longer needed the masks. It had her. In the mirror, her lips looked sculpted, too symmetrical, too still. She tried to smile, but the edges didn't curl right. It looked painted, pressed into place, unreal, until she saw them twitch, not from her command, but as if someone else was practicing, from within. Her journal entries grew stranger. She would write a question before bed, and in the morning, a different hand would write the answer. She flipped through the pages and found dozens of entries she couldn't remember. Sketches of her own face, but distorted. The mouth always open, always wider, always breathing. One page simply read, "Clay remembers, flesh forgets." On the 13th night, she didn't dream. Instead, she watched herself sleep. Her spirit, her mind, whatever was left of her, stood beside her own body and watched it lie motionless, breathing, not snoring, not twitching, just rising and falling like a perfect ritual. And then the body turned its head slowly and looked at her. The eyes were hollow, but the mouth whispered,
Go back in. You're not finished." She woke gasping, drenched in clay-rich sweat, and her jaw ached. She opened her mouth slowly, painfully. Something inside had hardened, a ridge across her inner cheek, a seam. She reached back with her fingers and touched the roof of her mouth. It no longer felt soft. It felt like kiln-fired earth, and beneath it, a steady, slow pulse. She returned to the altar room. The wall was no longer just cracked. It was opening. A thin line had formed down its center, a seam like lips closed tight. And as she stood there, it slowly opened. No door, no latch, just wood splitting like skin. And behind it, nothing. Not darkness, not a room, just breath. A vast, endless exhale, like standing in the mouth of something older than language. And in that breath, she heard them, her grandmother, her aunt, the unnamed ancestors, the ones who were never masked, the ones buried in silence, and now her. The wall spoke in one voice. The mouth was never meant to be closed, only passed down. Arya fell to her knees. She touched her chest. Inside, her heart still beat, but around it, clay, thick and slow, forming itself. She understood then. She wasn't being haunted. She wasn't being taken. She was being prepared for what came next, for what breathed beneath the floorboards, behind the altar, beneath the masks, the breath that needed a new skin. And she was almost ready, almost set.
For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that brought peace, but the kind that came after a decision had been made. Arya sat in the center of the altar room, barefoot, knees folded, hands resting gently in her lap. The silence wrapped around her like damp cloth, heavy, final. She could no longer hear the walls breathing, because now she was breathing for them. Her skin no longer bled when cut. She tested it 2 nights ago, just a shallow slice across her wrist with the family's ancestral knife. No pain, no sting, only a thin line of pale gray clay rising like sap from a tree. It dried in seconds. She watched it harden across the wound and felt nothing. No panic, no fear, only acceptance. She no longer dreamed of running. She didn't even remember what it felt like to run. Her legs were heavier each day. Her joints slowed to bend. Her fingers molded slightly when pressed against hard surfaces, as if they remembered their original form. Not bone, not flesh, but earth. And her mouth, oh, her mouth, no longer obeyed her fully. When she whispered, it was often not her words that came out. And when she stayed silent, she still heard her lips moving in her sleep, reciting names she didn't know, prayers in a dialect long extinct, syllables that tasted like mud and old breath. That morning, she woke to find a thread of red twine tied gently around her neck. She hadn't put it there. No one had. And yet, it was there. Soft, damp, warm. The same thread once used to seal the mouths of the dead before clay was applied. A ceremonial sign, a signal. This vessel is ready. The villagers stopped acknowledging her presence. Children no longer looked at her face. Old women offered no blessings. Even the crows, once noisy on the roof, were gone.
Not dead, just absent, as if nature itself understood something else now lived in Aria's body, and it was not to be interrupted. The floorboards of the altar room had warped, subtly, bowing inward toward the center, toward her. She hadn't moved from the same spot in hours, maybe days. Time folded now like wet cloth in the dark. She no longer needed food. She no longer needed sleep. She just breathed. Each inhale was thick, each exhale slower than the last. And with every breath, she felt them. The ancestors, the nameless, the forgotten, those who had never received a mask, those whose final breath had never been captured in clay. They now lived inside her, whispering, turning, shaping, finishing what the masks could not. She raised her hand slowly and pressed her fingers against her cheek. It no longer felt like skin. It felt like a wall of clay. A wall of clay still soft, still moldable, still open. She pushed. The surface gave way, and behind it there was nothing. Not bone, not tissue, only air, moving, swirling, alive. She wasn't hollow, she was a lung. The altar wall opened again that night, without noise, without resistance, just a quiet split through the wood, and behind it, not a room, not a tunnel, but a mouth the size of the house, made of wood and shadow and memory. Its lips formed by beams, its teeth carved into rafters, and at the center, a tongue made of clay. It didn't speak, it only waited and breathed. Aria rose without effort. Her feet touched the ground, silent, seamless, no longer heavy, no longer human. She walked to the mouth. She knelt before it, and without fear, without thought, she opened her own mouth and let the house breathe through her. All the breath that had ever been trapped, all the final gasps, the broken prayers, the silenced screams, poured out of her, through her, as if the ancestors had been holding their breath for generations, and now at last were allowed to speak. The house exhaled, the walls shook, the roof moaned, the ground trembled beneath her feet, and from deep inside the wooden mouth came one final phrase, not in her voice, not in anyone's. Set and sealed. She is now the mask. The altar glowed faintly, not with light, but with warmth, the kind that lives in a newborn's breath or the mouth of something very, very old. And in the center of the altar, resting gently on a pedestal, a new mask, still wet, still soft, shaped perfectly in Aria's likeness, but its eyes were closed, its lips slightly open, and inside the mouth, air, moving, waiting, listening. Aria was nowhere to be found, not in the village, not in the swamp, not beneath the earth. But when the wind passed through the cracks in the ancestral house, the wood whispered her name, not once, but forever, in rhythm, with every breath. It began with the baby's first breath, a sharp gasp, like all newborns make. Only this time, the room fell silent. No crying, no wailing, just the sound of a single inhalation, and then nothing. The midwife looked down in confusion. The child in her arms blinked, tiny chest rising and falling slowly, rhythmically. But she never cried. "Strange," the midwife whispered. "Strong lungs, but no sound." The mother, a distant cousin of Arya, reached for her daughter with trembling hands. "Is she breathing?" "Yes," the midwife said uneasily. "But not like a child." The birth took place in the rebuilt wing of the ancestral house, weeks after Arya disappeared. The elders refused to speak of what had happened. The walls were patched, the altar wiped clean. No masks remained, no names were uttered. But everyone knew the house still breathed. Slower now, content, as though it had eaten its fill. And this child, born within it, unmarked, maskless, was not truly new. They named her Mali, a small thing, quiet, observant. She rarely cried, rarely laughed, but she watched. God, how she watched. Eyes too dark, too knowing. She seemed to recognize every room, every stair, every creaking board, even though she had just learned to crawl. Sometimes she sat for hours before the blank altar wall, babbling softly at the cracks, though no one else could hear the air pulsing behind it. And every night she slept soundlessly, not with the stillness of a child, but with the restful breath of something ancient. By her first birthday, she spoke, but not words, names, old ones, long forgotten. Once she whispered, Pina, her great-grandmother's name. Then Neon, a great-uncle lost in the flood. And one evening, as she sat alone in the center of the altar room, Arya, soft, loving, like a mother calling to a daughter, or a daughter remembering the breath of someone who had never left. The family grew afraid. They tried to move her crib out of the house. The moment they crossed the threshold, Mali screamed. Not a child's scream, a deep, wet howl that rattled the walls. It wasn't hers. It was borrowed, passed down, remembered. They left her in the house. She calmed instantly, and as the door closed behind them, she exhaled, a perfect rhythm, just like Arya. One night, the mother found Mali kneeling before the altar, pressing her little palm to the wooden wall. The cracks had deepened again, forming lines, almost a shape, a face. No eyes, no ears, only a mouth, open, waiting. "Come here, sweet one," the mother whispered. But Mali didn't move. She just turned her head slowly and smiled. It wasn't mischievous. It wasn't playful. It was old. The kind of smile worn by someone who had breathed through 100 bodies and still remembered the shape of each throat. And she said, "No mask, no need. I am the breath now." The mother dropped the candle. The flame flickered, caught on the rug, died out. Darkness flooded the room for a moment, just long enough for the whisper to rise. She came back, and she chose the beginning. Mali stood and walked toward her mother. Only 1 year old, steady, balanced. Each step pressed softly into the wood, and the floor breathed beneath her. In, out, In, out. The house knew her, recognized her weight, welcomed her return. From that day forward, no child born in the village cried, not one. They came into the world breathing calmly, deeply, like they already knew how the rhythm worked. And when they died, no one made masks anymore. There was no need. The breath didn't wander. It stayed. In the walls, in the earth, in the children, passed from mouth to mouth like a ritual too sacred for clay. And in the center of the ancestral home, where the masks once hung, where names were once carved, where aria once sealed the mouth of the past, there was only silence. But if you sat long enough, if you closed your eyes, you could hear it. Not haunting, not horror, just breathing. From the child, from the wood, from the ones who never left, and from the clay beneath your own skin.
It began slowly, not with screams, not with terror, just fewer words. First, the elders stopped speaking during meals. They nodded, gestured, grunted. Their mouths opened only for breath, not for questions. Then the children followed. Even the boldest ones who used to chase each other through the fields now played in silence, running barefoot through wet paths, laughing only with their eyes. And finally, the priests. They ceased their chanting during funerals. There were no eulogies, no prayers, just the sound of inhalation, then exhalation, repeated, shared, unified. The village didn't call it a curse. They called it the stillness. No one died violently, but those who tried to leave never returned. And if they did, they came back changed. Their voices low, their sentences broken, as if whatever air they'd borrowed outside the village no longer fit in their lungs, as if they'd forgotten how to form sound without permission. Most never spoke again. They lived, yes, but they breathed for someone else. Molly grew older, but she aged differently. By the time she was 3, she moved with the grace of someone who had walked the earth before it bore names. She could stare at a storm and predict when it would stop. She could place her palm on a newborn's chest and match their breath to the rhythm of the floor. She would walk into the altar room and vanish for hours. No one dared disturb her. They called her the first inhale. Some believed she was Aria reborn. Others whispered she was older still. But all agreed she remembered, not in words, but in breath. One autumn, a visitor arrived, a researcher, a young woman from the capital. She came with a voice recorder, notebooks, and a plan to write her thesis on undocumented rituals of forgotten swamp villages. She smiled too wide, spoke too fast, tried too hard to connect. The villagers welcomed her politely, fed her, nodded at her questions, but they said nothing. Not because they didn't know, but because they would not let her breathe the wrong air. On her 3rd day, she found Molly sitting alone near the well. "Do you speak?" the researcher asked. Molly blinked. Then she opened her mouth and exhaled.
The researcher staggered back, choking. The air had weight, muddy, thick, aged. It filled her mouth, her sinuses, her chest. She collapsed to her knees, gasping. And Molly whispered, "Your breath doesn't belong here." The researcher left that night. She didn't speak again for 4 months. And when she did, she told no one what had happened. Only that when she tried to write her thesis, every page came out the same. A sketch of a mouth, open, breathing, smiling. Years passed. The masks never returned to the walls. The facemaker vanished. The well overflowed, then sank into itself. And the altar room began to sprout moss from the cracks, green veins tracing the path where breath still flowed. The villagers no longer asked why, because they no longer needed to understand. They only needed to breathe together. When children were born, they were placed in the altar room for 1 night. If the house accepted their rhythm, they would sleep soundly. If not, they would wail until dawn, and by morning their lungs would be empty. But that rarely happened anymore. Most infants took their first breath and never cried. Visitors grew fewer. Stories stopped leaving the village. It was said that the road in had shifted, grown longer, wetter, harder to follow. Some believed the swamp itself was swallowing the paths. Others said the breath of the house was growing so deep that it pulled everything inward, like lungs preparing for one final, eternal inhale. One day, Molly disappeared. No one saw her leave. No one saw her die. But in the center of the altar room, a new formation had appeared in the wall. Not a crack, not a hole, a ripple, like someone had pressed their face into the wood, and the wood had remembered it. Not just the outline, but the breath. And when the wind moved through the village at dusk, you could hear it. A little girl's exhale, endless, calm, older than time. No one in the village speaks now. They simply breathe, together, in rhythm, always in rhythm. And if you ever visit, and if you find the house, and if you dare to enter the room without knocking, don't speak, don't cry, don't call out, just listen. To the walls, to the floor, to the air between the masks that are no longer there. And if you hear your name, run, because that means the house has chosen you, and it wants you to stay as its next mouth.
Long before the house was built, before the masks, before the clay knew the shape of grief, there was breath. It lived in the belly of the land, beneath mud, beneath roots, beneath memory, and it waited. Not as a spirit, not as a god, but as a hunger. Not for flesh, not for blood, but for something deeper, for lungs, for a voice, for a mouth it could wear. The villagers had long forgotten the story, but the earth remembered. Its lanes still pulsed with damp rhythm. Its winds still whispered old syllables under their breath. And now, through Arya, through Molly, through silence passed down like prayer, the breath had returned home. But beneath the altar, deeper than any footstep, beyond the reach of even ancestral roots, there was still something sealed, a place they called the undug mouth. It had no path, no map, only stories, and even those were fading. The last person to hear its voice was a child, nameless, born to no mother, a creature that emerged from the clay one summer, eyes open, breathing perfectly in rhythm. The villagers never touched it. They simply watched. And when it turned 7, it walked into the forest barefoot and disappeared beneath the banyan trees. No one followed, because everyone knew the mouth beneath the earth had called its firstborn home. The altar room had begun to warp, not rot, not break, bend. The floor dipped in a shallow curve, as though something beneath it was exhaling. The air grew warmer each day, not with heat, with breath. The kind that fogs mirrors, the kind that curls the edges of paper, the kind that speaks even when no words are used. One night, a small boy entered the room and placed his hand on the floor. He was 4. He had never been told the stories, but he knelt anyway and whispered, "I'm ready." The floor pulsed beneath his fingers, not once, but twice, like a heartbeat, like approval. A week later, the villagers found a tunnel beneath the house, narrow, descending, lined with damp clay. No tools had been used. The earth had opened on its own, or maybe from the inside. The elders gathered. No one spoke, but they all breathed together, in, out. Then the oldest among them stepped forward and entered the tunnel. He was never seen again. But that night, the wind shifted, and it carried with it the scent of wet earth and something older than rot. Arya's name was heard for the last time, not screamed, not whispered, just exhaled from the soil. Arya. Beneath the house, the tunnel wound downward in perfect spiral, walls slick with clay, symbols etched deep into the mud, markings that matched no script but felt familiar. Somewhere far below there was a sound. Not water, not rock, breathing. Slow, immense, steady, like the lungs of the earth itself had begun to wake. In the deepest chamber, beyond reach of sun or root, lay a mound. Not a body, not a grave, just a mouth, formed entirely from earth, massive, open, still, and when approached, it did not speak. It breathed in, not out, not yet, as if it had been waiting for someone to arrive, so it could finally exhale. No one knows what came up from that tunnel, only that after that night, no birds returned to the trees, no frog sang in the swamp, and no child in the village ever asked questions again, because they already knew. Not from stories, not from speech, from within. They had been born carrying the answer in their lungs. Above ground, the house remained still. But sometimes, if you place your ear to the floor just before dawn, you can hear it. A voice from beneath the wood, from beneath the clay, from beneath the first breath ever taken. And it says only one thing. We were not meant to speak, only to carry. No one remembered when the festival began. There was no marked date, no chosen host, no spoken invitation. And yet every year, on a moonless night, when the swamp wind stilled and the water lay flat as glass, the village gathered, not by summons, not by bells, but by breath. They called it the Festival of the Unspoken. There were no drums, no lanterns, no greetings, only silence, and the sound of hundreds of lungs inhaling and exhaling in unison, like a slow tide inside a shared chest. One house, one village, one lung. Children were led barefoot down the damp path toward the ancestral house. No one taught them the rituals. They already knew. From birth, from the first breath, from the way the wooden cradle creaked with the rhythm of breath beneath the floor, from the cold that seeped through the walls at night, not wind, but exhalation. The last person to speak during the festival had done so many years ago. A girl, newly returned from the city, whispered, "Why is no one saying anything?" Moments later, she couldn't breathe. Her own breath caught mid-chest, refusing to move forward or back, like her lungs had become strangers to her body. She collapsed. Her mouth hung open, but no sound escaped. Only mud. Thick, warm, rising from her throat as if it had lived there all along. And in the firelight, someone swore they saw her lips close from the inside. Since then, no one spoke at the festival. No one asked questions. No one needed to. At dusk, the entire village formed a circle around the ancestral house. Its walls were no longer just wood. They had softened over the years, darkened, warped, and learned to breathe. It was said the structure now remembered names not spoken aloud and carried memories too heavy for mouths. The door no longer creaked open. It simply sighed. Molly, now older but untouched by time, stood at the center. She didn't lead the ceremony. She simply stood, barefoot on the breathing floor, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the house itself. No one bowed, no one lit candles, no incense burned. Breath was the offering. Silence was the vow. In that space between inhalation and exhalation, the house began to respond. The floor pulsed, the walls swelled. A low subterranean hum filled the air. Not music, not voice, something deeper. A memory made audible. Arya's breath, Ida's rage, the clay's sorrow. All of it rising from beneath the house like steam from a forgotten mouth. A child stepped forward, a boy no older than 4. He placed his small hand on the floor and pressed his ear against it. Then he breathed out, long, slow, deliberate. And the house breathed in. The room pulsed with agreement, acceptance. He had been received. No one clapped, no one cried. Only breath moved through them all, shared, circulated, like a prayer too sacred for language. That night, no one slept. They lay on mats or bare floorboards, eyes closed, mouths shut, breathing together like notes in an ancient melody. And through it all, the walls whispered, "Do not speak. Do not shape breath into meaning. Just give it back. We'll remember it for you." By morning, the house was still. The floor no longer moved.
the walls returned to silence. The mouth of the altar wall closed again. But the children, when they awoke, no longer needed names. They had learned the shape of each other through rhythm alone. Inhale, exhale. And in that rhythm, they knew everything. Outside the village, the world erased the region. Scholars lost records. The swamp grew wider. The road sank beneath water. Even birds changed their flight paths, as if nature itself whispered, "Let them be. They are not yours anymore." But if you ever find the village, if you follow the wrong fog one night, or take a step too far into the breathing earth, you might stumble across it. The people will greet you, not with smiles, not with words, just a shared breath and a single pause. And if you speak, they will not punish you. They will only wait and listen. To the air inside your lungs, to the voice behind your breath, to the question you didn't mean to carry. And if you stay too long, if you breathe too deeply, you'll forget the words too. Your voice will fall silent. And one day, you will sit in the circle, hand on the floor, eyes closed, and the house will breathe you in, like it always does.
Before breath learned to speak, before lungs knew names, before mouths were shaped by language, there was clay, still, wet, watching. It did not think, it did not dream, it simply waited. Not all earth is the same. Some soil sleeps, some rots, but some remembers. And in this village, deep beneath the surface, there is a type of clay that was never touched by fire, because it was already alive. They say the first human here was not born, but formed, not by gods, not by hands, but by the land itself. One rain-heavy season, the swamp rose higher than the trees, and when it receded, it left behind a body, mouth agape, lungs full, eyes closed, and before anyone found it, it breathed. The villagers buried the figure, not out of fear, but respect. They knew it wasn't dead, not fully, just resting. And every season since, the clay beneath that burial site has watched, not with eyes, with silence, with breath that never escapes, with memory that never fades. In recent days, the children of the village began drawing strange shapes into the dirt. They didn't know what they meant, but the elders did. Old markings, once carved into the walls of the first altar room, now long erased, but the clay remembered, and it whispered them back through tiny hands. Molly, though no longer seen, was felt. The children spoke her name with their breath, not their voices. They exhaled, "Ma," then held the rest in silence. A name unfinished, left to form inside the earth, and the earth listened. One boy, no older than 6, began waking in the night with mud between his fingers, not from play, from digging. He said he dreamed of eyes beneath the ground, not looking up, but inward, staring forever into the breath that shaped them. He asked, "What happens when clay opens its eyes?"
No one answered, but the house pulsed once that night, stronger than ever before, and the swamp did not breathe. It stared. The altar wall cracked again, not from age, from movement. A single slit appeared across the center beam, horizontal, not vertical like before, like a closed eye twitching. And in the silence of the festival night, someone swore they saw it blink. A young girl disappeared. They found her 3 days later, kneeling at the edge of the riverbank, smiling, her body caked in thick, unmoving clay. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just breathed in perfect rhythm with the wind. And when they washed her hands, they saw something scratched into her skin. A circle with a single dot and 4 lines radiating outward. The watching mouth, a symbol older than any god. That week, the floorboards of the ancestral house began to soften. Children said it felt like skin, warm, alive. Some pressed their ears to it and claimed they heard dreams, not voices, not words, but just visions passed through the rhythm of earth, of a great face buried beneath the mud, waiting to be remembered, not so it could rise, but so it could see. The village elders gathered. For the first time in years, they considered digging again, but not to bury, to reveal. The clay no longer wanted masks. It no longer needed lungs. It was done borrowing mouths. Now it wanted to look back, to see the ones who carried it, to make them feel what it had felt for centuries, buried, unspoken, breathing through strangers. At dawn, a shallow pit appeared near the center of the village. No one dug it, no one filled it, but it steamed in the morning air. And in the center of the pit, the mud had formed a face, crude, childlike, but unmistakably watching. Its eyes blinked once, and then it whispered, not with sound, but heat rising from the ground. "We see you now. Do you see us?" From that day forward, everyone in the village closed their eyes when they breathed, not from fear, but from respect, because the clay was always watching, and now it had learned to see.
Long before language, before names, before the first ancestor pressed clay to dying lips, there was the first mouth. It was not human, not divine. It did not speak. It simply opened, and through it, the world learned how to breathe. The elders never told the whole truth. Perhaps they didn't know it. Perhaps it was passed down not in words, but in rhythm, encoded in the way mothers held their children's heads as they inhaled, in the way floorboards swelled beneath sleepers' chests, in the shared silence around the altar. But it was always there, a quiet knowing. There is a mouth beneath this land, and it never closed. In the oldest story, one never written, only exhaled during fever or death, it is said, "The first breath came not from lungs, but from the swamp, from a pit in the earth so deep it had forgotten what light was. There the clay shifted, took shape, became soft, became form, and from it rose a mouth, unformed, unfed, waiting not to speak, but to be spoken through." When Molly vanished for the final time,
the swamp changed. Not dramatically, just aligned. The trees leaned in a little closer. The wind no longer echoed. The ground felt warmer under bare feet. It was as if the land had taken a breath so deep it forgot to release it. And then it called. Not with a sound, not with a scream, just a pull. A slow tightening in the chest of every villager, like someone was gently placing their hand over your sternum and whispering, "Come home." They came one by one, at night, silent, eyes closed. The old, the young, even the infants in arms. No one forced them. No one led them. They knew the way. To the mouth. It wasn't a cave, or a hole, or a tunnel. It was a shape in the earth, formed by centuries of soft breath and undisturbed silence. A perfect oval, wide, dark, endless. And when they stood at its edge, they didn't see darkness. They saw reflection, not in water, not in glass, but in movement. Each inhale from the villagers matched by an exhale from below. Not air, not wind, understanding. Then Molly stepped forward, or something shaped like her, not aged, not withered, but complete. Her mouth did not move, but the villagers heard her in their bones. You are the last mouth, but you are also the first. One man wept, without sound. He had spent his life carving maims into masks, sealing lips shut, believing he was preserving legacy. But he understood now. He had only been holding the breath hostage. Another woman dropped to her knees. Her hand trembled, stained from years of molding clay. But the clay had never belonged to her. It had simply waited for this moment, for this return. Molly, the vessel, the breath, the memory, reached down and touched the mouth in the earth. And it opened. No teeth, no throat, just a soft, endless wind. It didn't pull them in, it invited them. And one by one, they stepped forward, not to die, not to disappear, but to merge. Because this had never been about sealing the dead, it had always been about preparing the living. Preparing them to become part of something far older and far larger than memory. A breath that never began, a breath that will never end. As each villager entered, the air above the swamp grew still. No more breeze, no more sound. Until the final child stepped in, and the earth closed, not with weight, but with silence. A silence so total, it made the stars blink slower. Years passed, perhaps centuries. The village was forgotten. The swamp expanded. The maps erased themselves. The air above that land grew heavy with something unnameable. And if a traveler wandered too far and found themselves at the edge of that stillness, they would feel it. A pressure in the lungs, a pause in the heart. And sometimes, if they listened closely, they would hear a mouth opening right beneath their feet.
They say the land is empty now, that the swamp swallowed the houses, that the trees grew over the roads, that the wind no longer remembers the name of the village, and yet something still breathes there. There are no buildings left, no walls, no masks, no altar. But those who wander too deep into the marsh often stop mid-step. Their lungs tighten, their pulse slows, and they feel it, a rhythm, not theirs, older, more patient, woven into the roots beneath their feet, hung in the air like mist, moving in and out of their chest, with or without their permission. Local legend calls it the unfinished exhale, a place where breath never ends, not because it cannot, but because it must not. No one truly remembers the people who lived here, not their faces, not their names, only fragments. A house that could breathe, a child who never cried, a mouth in the earth that never shut. And yet, whenever someone speaks near the edge of the swamp, their words seem slower, as if the air around them is reluctant to carry meaning, as if language offends the silence beneath. There's a story of a monk who tried to bless the land. He lit incense, chanted sacred sutras, pressed his palm to the ground and whispered, "Release them." But before the words left his mouth, his voice cracked, and he fell silent. He was found days later, kneeling in the mud, mouth closed, eyes open, still breathing. It's not possession, it's not revenge, it's not even haunting. It's an inheritance, because what was buried here was never meant to stay still. It was meant to continue, in lungs, in silence, in the warm clay under every footstep. Sometimes on windless nights, travelers claim they hear something rising from the water. Not a whisper, not a song, just breath. A long, low exhale that seems to come from everywhere at once, from the fog, from the trees, from the mirror of still water, and from within themselves. The scholars who study this place call it anomaly, geological disturbance, acoustic delusion. They dig, they test air samples, they mark maps. But the deeper they dig, the less they find. Until eventually, they stop breathing, just for a moment. And in that stillness, they hear it. The house, the altar, the masks, the child, all breathing through them. Not to scare, to continue. Because the first mouth was never a curse. It was a promise that memory will never die as long as someone, somewhere, is willing to inhale without asking why, and exhale without expecting a reply. You may think this is just a story, a strange village, a superstition born of soil and silence. But tonight, when you lie in bed, watch the ceiling, feel the weight in your chest, and ask yourself, who is doing the breathing? You or something remembering itself through you? Close your eyes. Place your hand on your chest. In, out. In, out. And if it starts to feel unfamiliar, if your lungs feel borrowed, if your breath begins to slow without your consent, don't speak, don't run, just listen.
because somewhere deep in the earth beneath you, it still breathes.